Hello, welcome to the Midnight Quill podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Tegan, also known as TC Emerys. I'm a writer, professional ghostwriter, and fiction editor. My debut short story collection, The Weight of Rain, was released last year. Now over to my co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Maddie, or MJ Glenn. I run Softwood Self-Publishing, which helps authors through the entire self-publishing process. I've also published my own debut fantasy novel called On the Edge, which you can buy on Amazon now.
And my name is Maisy, and I'm primarily a screenwriter who occasionally dabbles in poetry.
This is our first ever episode, Show, Don't Tell. So if you've attended any creative writing class, read any writing blogs, or been around on social media, you've probably heard the phrase show, don't tell. I've been researching its origins to try and garner a little bit of insight into where this came from and start our discussion on how to use it properly. Although some claim a widely misquoted letter from Anton Chekhov about describing nature as the source of this idea, the phrase seems to have been popularized by a book by essayist Percy Lubbock, I hope I'm saying that correctly, called The Craft of Fiction. Here's the quote. "The art of fiction does not begin until the novelist thinks of his story as a matter to be shown, to be so exhibited that it will tell itself." So with that in mind, I'm going to turn over to my co-hosts. What do you both think show, don't tell really means to writers today?
I think show, don't tell can be quite a difficult thing to explain to writers. It's very obvious when it goes wrong, when you tell rather than show, but it's strangely difficult to explain and describe, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it's all the examples I hear make out like it's so black and white, but sometimes it's quite difficult to pin down. What do you think, Maisy?
I think with writing, if you're trying to write prose especially, the idea of showing something when you're using words is really odd, because showing implies seeing something or viewing something, and you can't possibly do that other than in your head, in your imagination. I think it's a good guide. I think it's a good tip, but I don't always think it's something to like follow particularly.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're going to come back to, is this idea of like, is it actually a useful phrase to apply all of the time? But should we start with thinking about what some bad examples of showing actually are? Because as much as it's hard to pin down, I think we can think of some really rubbish examples of trying to show, because it fails quite a lot, doesn't it?
So essentially, I mean, the problem is when people tell their characters' emotions rather than showing them.
Yeah.
And it can kind of make for quite dull reading. If you have a character who said something and you just say they shouted or they felt angry, and it surprisingly pops up quite a lot. So I suppose instead of just saying how your character feels, show it through their reactions and their emotions.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's sometimes why the description after dialogue is like the biggest tripping up point for writers, because you need to let your dialogue shine. And if you're finding yourself writing, he shouted because he was really angry at the end of your dialogue, then you've not shown anything. You're just telling the reader what to think.
Yeah, I actually find it really helpful to have my characters do sort of actions while they're talking.
Yeah.
So if somebody's really angry, they normally do short, sharp actions, or they don't look at your face, or they look at the floor, or they turn away from you. And I would break up the dialogue and split it and sort of add in those bits of sort of physical reactions which show how a character is feeling, show how a person is feeling, instead of saying they shouted, they said angrily.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's really interesting you see it a lot in fantasy books when something happens, a piece of action, and then you flick over the page and it's a whole chapter of backstory which explains why that person did that specific thing. Do you know what I mean? And you just think, like, how necessary was that? And I guess that, I don't know whether you can classify that as showing or telling, because you're showing why that character did that thing, but are you not just telling a story within a story?
Yeah. So I think that we need to talk about what exposition is in a narrative and how it functions with showing and telling. So for our listeners, exposition is the insertion of background information to a story or narrative. So it can often function as like an info dump with setting characters' backstories or prior plot events. The problem with exposition is that when you embed it within a narrative that's already going along, it can just be like, here's some information that you didn't know. And, you know, sometimes I think it can be quite lazy. What do you guys think?
Yeah, sometimes it seems to be kind of put there just as filler. And just say, oh, by the way, I need to explain this story, when there are far more interesting techniques to use to put that information in when it's needed. For example, another character could mention some kind of backstory and they'd have a conversation about it, or they could just be reminded of something and very briefly explain why, you know. But info dumps tend to appear a bit randomly. Instead of I mean, memories from real human memories, they emerge when something's sort of triggered. And I think the problem with info dumps is they seem to just, the point of them is to tell the reader something rather than to have the character remember.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. What about you, Maisy?
I think I agree. I think they're really fun to write. I think it's really fun because it's everything that you've been keeping either in your head or in a notebook, and you're like, right, bam, 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 I'm gonna tell you all the things that I've been working on. But actually it's not fun to read. It's really, really boring.
I think you're so right about that.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're like a huge fan of an author's work, it's still kind of boring to go through their notebook and be like, okay, so that's the history of Hogwarts, but it's not actually that fascinating because it's just kind of historical notes that didn't make it into the story. And that's kind of what it feels like. If there's a really important reason for that information being there, you need to find a plot point or a moment that will force the information to come to appear,
to show the information rather than just info dump it in. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're in a few episodes time we're going to talk about self-editing, and I think that this is really quite key. One of my writing mentors used to say this phrase to me, kill your darlings, which at the time I didn't really understand, but it basically just means, like Maisy says, it's in your head, it's precious to you, it doesn't mean it's useful for the plot, you know. And maybe you don't delete it, maybe you put it into a different document and keep it, and you know, you can read it to yourself. But I don't think the reader always needs to be told all that expositional information. It's just not necessary. It's lazy. You should show through dialogue and action, you know, what's happened in the past, what's formed your characters. So,
but also it just doesn't read well when you tell the reader everything all at once.
Yes.
Try and break up the most important information throughout. Try and find places to pull out that information instead of just, here it is, here's the entire backstory of this city that we're set in.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. So I want to do a little change of pace here and ask a question that I'm not really sure if I know what I feel about this. So I'm really curious to see what you guys are going to say. How can we show rather than tell with a first person point of view? I think this is something that our listeners are probably going to be a little bit worried about, because when you have a narrator who is talking about their first person experience, it can be really difficult to show everything that's going on in the world that you've created through the eyes of this one person. If you're not using a third person narrator, you're using first person narrator. So what do you guys think? How can we show rather than tell with a first person point of view?
You need to think about how you personally would react to something. Now, when something upsets you, you don't necessarily react in the most logical way, and you don't necessarily know why you react in that way. So try and put yourself in your character's shoes and think of them as a really realistic person, and they could react illogically, and they could not really understand why they're reacting. Instead of spelling out their behavior and their reactions, if they react in a certain way, it's sometimes really obvious to the reader how a person is feeling when it isn't necessarily obvious to the person.
Yeah. I think that other characters and dialogue are really useful for first person narration, because when you have what is essentially a biased narrator, not that any narrator is ever unbiased, but when you have a first person narrator, obviously they're just showing you their point of view on the world. But when you do have that, the way that other characters react to them and what they say in their dialogue is a really good way for you to sort of hint at a different perspective on what's happening.
Definitely.
So moving on from that and kind of linking to what we were just saying, how can we use dialogue and showing at the same time? Because I think people really do struggle with that. And Maddie, you kind of touched earlier on having actions in the dialogue. So like have someone fiddling with something. I love having a character fiddle while they're talking. Like I did a scene in Parsnips in The Weight of Rain while they're smoking. And I don't smoke personally, but I just thought, like, when you're talking, you are moving your hands and you are doing things at the same time. And I hate scenes where the characters are just stood talking directly to one another and not doing anything else, because it is very rarely happens in real life. So the dialogue itself, let's start with that. What can we do with dialogue to show rather than tell? So avoiding info dumps and exposition in the dialogue, and instead showing what's going to happen, showing something about the characters.
I think dialogue is a really good vehicle for that, because often what you want the character to actually say isn't what they say. What they actually mean isn't what they're putting out there. I had feedback recently on a character that I'm working on, and the feedback was, they're really horrible. This character is really horrible. And they sort of put it forward like a negative thing. But I was like, no, that's what I'm going for. You know, if that's how you're receiving her, that's great. That's something to work on. But I definitely think, you know, the implication is where show don't tell really comes in. And you can say so much more by saying little or saying something completely different. I've got a really good quote that I'd like to share with you guys.
Oh yeah.
I've been reading this book called Writing a Novel by Richard Skinner, who is a creative writing teacher at Faber Academy. And it's basically just like a massive guide on how to write. And there's a great quote on this exact topic. It's, show don't tell means writing about what is visible and tangible in order to speak of what is invisible and intangible. And it's like, that's great. That's exactly what it is. Right? Like you're saying things without ever really saying them, which is, you know, what works in film so well, the implied, what you're seeing, rather than what you're hearing. And it's just working out a way to put that into prose.
In terms of dialogue, I think it's actually quite important sometimes to not have dialogue, to leave out the things that need to be said. What isn't said can actually show quite a lot of what's going on, or what it can show what the character is nervous about talking about, what somebody else is hiding.
That's a really good point, actually. I think, like Maisy was saying, reading between the lines of what is said is sometimes about, like you say, Maddie, leaving some things out, and maybe leaving out quite a lot of dialogue. Some examples that I thought of from things that I've read, and I'm not going to say where I've read them, but here's a line for you to give the listeners an idea of what they shouldn't be doing. So the actual dialogue here says, "I hate you," right? I think we can get a pretty good idea of the tone. But the writer here had written, "He was fuming as he shouted, 'I hate you.'" So this is an example of kind of showing and telling at the same time, because you're telling the reader what to think. You're telling the person that he was fuming and he shouted. And then you've got dialogue that also says he's angry, or that there's a negative emotion going on here.
If you're trying to fix something like that, if you're looking at your own work and thinking, okay, I mean, how do I fix this? Just think, how do you say I hate you in a different way?
Yeah.
Yeah. And now if they're whispering it, then that's a personality trait. That's a very specific thing to say. But otherwise, you tend to shout it out loud. So you're going to assume that they've shouted it.
Yeah.
So there's just no point in saying they shouted it, because that's really obvious already. The dialogue has already done the job.
Exactly. I think that's really good what you said about whispering I hate you, because it's still obvious from the dialogue I hate you what the intention is, but like the whispering, that adds a completely different emotional connection. Is more sinister than shouting it. So yeah, I think that this is something that writers really need to be aware of. You need to go back through your dialogue and have a look and be like, what am I trying to say with the dialogue, and then what have I said with the description before or after it? Because often it's like the most cliched things that you write that end up being telling rather than showing.
I think it's really helpful to read the dialogue to yourself out loud.
Yeah.
Because if you say something like I hate you, you're going to say it more emphatically and louder.
Yeah.
And then if your text afterwards says she said emphatically and loudly, then you know that you've already done the job. You can cut out that little tag on, and that's telling. You've already said it out loud in that way.
Exactly.
And the reader will read it in that way.
And if it is something that you are struggling with in your writing, I find a good exercise is use cliches as like placeholders. If you don't have the poetry in you at that moment to write something really good, really strong, you just whack in the cliche and then you come back to it. I was working on something the other day where I wanted to talk about someone being like porcelain, like being delicate. And I put that in and then went through it again, and then I changed it to marshmallow because it was something, it's not the word I'm going to use, but it's something different to just placeholders. And I guess that comes back to self-editing. You do what you can at the time, and then you go back and then you work on it.
The first draft does not have to be perfect.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm writing a short story at the moment, and there are red marks all over it saying change this later, change this later, change this later, develop this, develop that, think about this. And I think you can do that if you feel like you're telling more than showing and you don't know how to fix it right then, keep your momentum, just put a red line under it and fix it later, come back to it and work out what's wrong later.
I think that's something that needs talking about more often, is that we all do these things accidentally. We all use cliches. We all show don't tell. Like we all make these mistakes. It's just the fact of coming back to it, recognizing what you've done, self-editing, maybe getting someone else's opinion. Like it's okay if you struggle to recognize these things in your own writing, but you need to be open to other people telling you, well, you've written he shouted furiously and you don't need to, and that's okay. We're all going to improve as we go along, and your first draft shouldn't ever see the light of day, honestly. Nobody should read it besides you, probably, because it probably was not up to scratch. That's all right. That's fine.
Even authors like Stephen King have said that,
exactly.
The first draft should not be seen by anyone but you.
Yeah, that's probably where I got it from.
Have you guys read his book on writing?
I haven't, but I keep meaning to. I hear it's very good.
It's incredible. I've never read Stephen King.
No.
I'm just putting it out there. I've never read him. I like the movies.
I've never read Stephen King. I just know he's very popular.
Yeah, I read it, and like halfway through the book, he literally like nearly died in a car accident, and then he came back and he finished off the book with like a completely different, not that his ideas were different, but just a completely different perspective, because the book had taken so long from the point where he started to recovering from a massive trauma into finishing, and it's like, it's really good. I'd really recommend it.
I think that's a really good lesson to take from that like sometimes you do need a perspective shift to come back to something and point something out.
I feel like I always like try and write really, really quickly because I just want to get it out, get it out, get it out. But actually, you can chill. There's time.
Oh, there is so much pressure just to have the next thing out, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's why instead of focusing my novel 2, which I should be focusing on, I started writing short stories because I feel like I can do them quicker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The last thing I wanted us to talk about was telling and authorial intent, because I think that there's a little bit of ego sometimes that goes along with telling your reader. It's almost as if some writers just can't bring themselves to trust that the reader is going to infer the intended meaning. So I thought we should discuss that, maybe put our author egos aside a little bit and sort of have a think about, can we trust our reader to get what we mean? And should we want to, our reader to get exactly what we intended? Or is it better if they interpret their own meaning sometimes?
I think this is such an interesting point because I've been having a big discussion about this in terms of my own novel recently. I believe that the reader is more intelligent than we think, and can work it out a lot easier than we think they can.
Yeah.
And spelling it out can get very dull for them, and they feel a little bit patronized. So recently, for my own work, I had someone read my book, and they said they couldn't picture my character at all. For me, I think that the reader can make up their own minds in terms of what the character looks like, and I think telling the reader too much about what they look like can make it a bit boring.
Yeah. And it is really difficult, isn't it, to put your trust in what other people are going to interpret. But I think you have to. I mean, speaking of reviews, I actually had a wonderful review. There's a story I wrote in The Weight of Rain called All Change Please, which is mostly written in second person from a wife to her husband who has left her. And it's sort of like an accusation, how could you have left me and the children kind of thing. And somebody wrote a review and was like, I love the story that's a letter. And I was like, that's great. I didn't write it as a letter, but that's brilliant that you sort of interpreted it that way. And so sometimes I think it can go the other way. Sometimes the readers come up with something even better than our intention. And so we have to trust and know that readers are intelligent people, and you don't have to tell them every little detail. They can pick it up for themselves.
Sometimes a reader might even interpret it in a way that, you didn't even intend that, or you meant the opposite.
Yeah.
And that is really up to the reader. You can't get annoyed that they interpreted it differently. When you do English, as at university and stuff, do you remember the phrase, the curtains are blue?
Yep, the curtains are blue.
Joke about how we'd analyze a text in such detail that we'd be like, oh, the curtains are blue, it represents her emotional feelings, and everyone would just laugh, being like, no, the curtains are just blue, okay? And the thing is, the author may have just decided the curtains are just blue for no reason whatsoever.
Exactly.
And the reader's there analysing it and thinking, oh, it represents how blue and melancholy she's feeling. Yeah. And it is up to the reader to just analyse it in their own way.
To think that, yeah. And for our listeners, Maddie actually has blue curtains behind her, so tied in perfectly. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
I had that actually back at university. I did a creative writing. I did the creative writing course in third year, and I had this poem that I'd written, and it was a lot of Christian imagery and quite an intimate sort of thing. And it was quite intense. And one of the best bit of feedback that I got was somebody said, this is like Judas talking to Jesus. And I was like, whoa,
that's a great premise.
It was such a good, it was something that was not in my mind whatsoever.
Or are you like, yes, that's what I meant to do.
Literally. Because the drama, the story that would, if you knew that was what it was about before you read it, then you'd think, oh, this is really interesting.
So I have one final thought, actually. I've just thought of another question to finish us off. Do you think that it's ever okay to tell rather than show?
I think sometimes it really is okay to just tell. I think it's completely dependent on what you're saying, what you're implying, and you know what sort of area you're working in. I'm not one for long sentences that have lots of description. You know, if it's 3 o'clock in the morning, I want you to just say it was 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't want to hear, you know, I don't want to have to read, oh, the hand on the clock on the sideboard was at a right angle. I'm not interested, I'm afraid. I'm just not interested. So I definitely think there is a time and a place for the brevity of telling rather than showing, definitely.
I think that's a great example.
Yeah, that's a really good example. But also sometimes, I mean, we say in dialogue, show, don't tell, we say it all the time, but sometimes you can just go, he said, she said. It's just don't overuse it.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. I think the key is to know, like, when you've crossed the line from, you know, telling all the time and not really doing what you need to do to tell the story. It should be used sparingly and effectively.
Yeah.
If you need to tell some details, you know, you need to say what the time is, fine. Whatever you need to say, she was weeping, you know, that's fine. It doesn't all have to be poetic and beautiful and metaphorical. But if you're spending all of your time just sort of patronizing the reader by laying it out really obviously, then you're probably not telling an engaging story.
I think the context, if the context and the dialogue make it obvious how the people are feeling or what's going on, then you don't need to tell the reader what's going on. Yeah. You just got to, when you read back through a work, you've just got to try and work out if it's obvious or not.
Yeah.
And if it really isn't, then yeah, you can tell. If it really is, if the dialogue already does the job, then don't tell the reader exactly how they feel. The dialogue does it already.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've said everything we want to say on this topic. Listeners, drop us a comment. What do you think? Do you think that it's ever okay to tell? Do you think that this phrase is outdated? I mean, the essay that I quoted at the beginning, the Percy Lubbock one, was written in the 1920s. You know, do we think that literary criticism has maybe moved on? Do we think that there's something that's more important than thinking about sharing and telling in our description and dialogue? Thank you very much for listening to our first ever episode. We're going to have more episodes every week. Come and subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us a comment, leave us a like, come and find us on Instagram. I'm going to leave all of our links in the description below, and have a great week.